Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Steve Cohen, Professor Steve Cohen of New York University, Princeton University, emeritus, joins me. Steve is the author of two pieces over these last weeks at The Nation. You can find them in thenation.com that will give you a guideline to how we got to the crisis of the moment in Europe. This is a global confrontation, but Europe is the home court advantage for Russia. There are headlines spanning from Ukraine to the capitals. I mentioned Steve's two pieces, one beginning with the Cold War again, who's responsible, and then asking about where is the debate over the Cold War, the new Cold War. That is no longer an issue. It is routinely now referred to as the Cold War. Steve, a very good evening to you. I begin with headlines because we must discuss Vladimir Putin's address in Sevastopol last Friday, the 9th of May, on the celebration of the Great Patriotic War victory over the Hitlerites. 69 years ago, however, also with language that points to the present and the future for the Russian Federation and the Russian people. The headlines that strike me as most significant right now is that the president of France, Francois Hollande, is pointing to the elections, May 25th, the presidential elections, saying these are important for Europe and for Ukraine, looking forward. Also, at the same time, the France's European Affairs Minister, Harlem Désir, says that additional sanctions may be imposed on Russia if there are more provocations. I mentioned that within these last hours, we had more sanctions laid on individuals in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Crimea. There's a list of now 61 sanctioned Europeans from Russia to Ukraine to Crimea in order to stop what is seen as the Russian aggression. Back to headlines, and this is just a spin around Europe. Norway's prime minister announces that they may resume military cooperation with Russia at the end of the month, depending upon results of negotiations. The prime minister of the interim government in Kiev, Yatsenyuk, a man who is not recognized as legitimate by Moscow and is recognized as legitimate by Washington and the EU, points to negotiation over the gas debt that Ukraine owes to Russia. There's said to be a meeting forthcoming in Greece, perhaps as early as May 16th, between the Russian energy minister, Alexander Novak, and the European Energy Commissioner, Gunther Oettinger, and the Ukrainian minister, Yuri Prodan. This is over an outstanding debt that Ukraine owes. In addition, looking forward, these negotiations are important because it's no longer about energy from Russia just for Ukraine. There is the question of energy for Europe, for the EU countries, in the possible moment that there will be a breakdown in negotiations over the Ukraine debt. This issue involves not just Ukraine and Kiev, but EU member states. I also mentioned quickly that Chancellor Merkel has restated something again in these last hours, that Ukraine crisis cannot be settled by military means. Steve, a very good evening to you. I've spun through Europe. It looks like we should begin, however, with your analysis of Vladimir Putin's speech on Friday in Crimea. Good evening to you, Steve.
Well, John, maybe we should start with the last headline you read, with Merkel's statement that the crisis cannot be solved by military means, because that'll take us back to Putin and last week's developments. Let's ask a question. Who is using military means in the Ukrainian crisis? Who alone, for the last 2 weeks, has deployed military force and killed people? The answer is our government in Kiev. That's a fact. That's not an apology for Putin. It's just a fact that the government in Kiev, and let's remember it came to power through a street uprising against the elected president of Ukraine, so it lacks legitimacy. To make the links, that's why it wants the presidential election on May 25th, even though it's a bad idea, and the United States is supporting that bad idea. But if the answer is diplomacy, and it surely is in Ukraine, and to get to diplomacy, the killing has to stop, then the party that's carrying out the killings and getting itself killed, because I gather today the Ukrainian army from Kiev suffered losses.
Yes, 7 killed on the road between Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. That's in Donetsk Oblast.
All right, now let's be clear. Those soldiers didn't get killed, may they rest in peace, defending Kiev. They got killed attacking cities in eastern Ukraine. They were sent there by the Kiev government. Merkel is not happy about this. Okay, let's now flash back, not to May 9th, but to May 7th, when Putin made this short speech that got the world's attention. He said, I look at what's going on, and I summarize, but paraphrase, but this is what he said. I look at what's going on in Ukraine. I looked at the footage of the 40 people burned, probably more than 40 now, closer to 50, people burned to death in Odessa in a building, and it's horrible. And things are spinning out of control. That's what Putin said. And then he said the following, and I recap because this is the ongoing story. Or it's not ongoing because the United States isn't participating, evidently. Putin says things are getting out of control. The West says the presence of my troops so close to the Ukrainian border is part of the problem. Okay, I've moved them back. Washington says he's lying. He didn't move them. Putin says, have a look at your satellite surveillance. You'll see I moved them back. Washington says, okay, we'll look. And we never heard another word out of Washington. So I don't know whether Putin was lying or whether he told the truth. Washington fell silent. The second thing Putin said is we were against a presidential election in Ukraine on May 25, because how can you have a national election when the troops of Kiev are attacking eastern Ukraine? How are you going to vote there? And anyway, eastern Ukraine has no candidates in the election. They're not permitted to campaign. But if you people think it's that important, so important that you're going to put more sanctions on us if we oppose those elections, okay, go ahead, be my guest. And then he dropped this bombshell, which you and I talked about, but nobody seems to want to follow up on. He said, I had a phone call with Merkel, and she says she has an idea. Let's have a roundtable. Let's sponsor a roundtable, a meeting in Ukraine of all the aggrieved parties. That's East Ukraine, that's Kiev, the government, that's West Ukraine, it's Central Ukraine. And let the Ukrainians sit down and talk. Talk about a constitution, talk about elections. Putin says, I support that idea. So Germany, Merkel, the strongest country in Europe, the de facto head of the European Union, supports it. Russia supports it. Washington hasn't said a word. So Merkel, in effect, returned to her idea. In this headline you read, she said the armed solution is not possible. It has to be diplomacy. I read that as criticism of Washington in Kiev. Though she's being too cute from my point of view, I think she should speak up, but she has problems. The oil question, the gas question, the other questions are part of this, but they're easy to solve. They're very easy to solve. And Moscow is ready to make a concession on the price of the natural gas, because remember what happened yesterday or the day before, John. The IMF gave Kiev the first $3.5 billion of the $17 billion. It says it's going to give it over the next few years. I doubt that. But Kiev has $3.5 billion. That's about what it owes Moscow for natural gas that Moscow already delivered to Kiev that's supposed to transit on to Europe. So Moscow said, that's great. Please send us the check for $3.5 billion. And as you just reported, Yatsenuk, the prime minister of Ukraine, said, well, we may pay you what we owe you if you lower the price of gas in the future. Well, that's a funny concept of the free market, that we'll pay you what we owe you if you'll give us a big discount on what we buy from you in the future. No, you're supposed to pay your debts, whether you get the discount on future deliveries or not. But I think the Russians will do that. And that's where things stand.
The remark by the Chancellor of Germany All channels should remain open for negotiation, said Mrs. Merkel in these last hours to a German newspaper. All representatives from regions in Ukrainian society speaking out against the use of force should participate in this national dialogue. Exactly what Professor Cohen just pointed to. She's restating her wish and Vladimir Putin's wish for a summit, a roundtable in Ukraine. When we come back, Vladimir Putin's speech last Friday. How did Steve hear the appeal to motherland, to acting together, to struggle? I'm John Batchelor with Professor Steve Cohen of NYU in Russian history, as well as at Princeton University. This is The John Batchelor Show.